is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight on the agenda.
Decriminalization is intended to remove some of that stigma and legal sanction to make it easier for people to access services and to be less likely to face short-term incarceration, which can cause harm and risk of overdose and can also lead to other social outcomes like losing your job and losing your housing.
This is a situation that a healthcare facility can't control, and I think these are things that we need to really step back and look at before we start signing on the dotted line to formally decriminalize illicit drugs. Let's have a plan.
Then, later on the agenda.
You can't isolate Russia. You can't isolate any country in the world if you don't have a single Asian power on board with your sanctions regime. And that's basically what is happening.
Decriminalizing controlled amounts of illicit drugs is supposed to light a path to treatment for users and destigmatize addiction. But has harm reduction actually been achieved? The year-and-a-half-old decriminalization pilot project in British Columbia has hit a snag over concerns about public safety. This week, the federal government approved BC's request to recriminalize drug use in public places. Meanwhile, the City of Toronto has been waiting 2 years for approval of its application to decriminalize drugs. Should that bid be adjusted as the city learns lessons from the West Coast? Let's ask. In Vancouver, British Columbia, DJ Larkin, Executive Director of the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition, and here in our studio, Derek Finkel, journalist and columnist for the National Post. And Derek, it's good to see you in the studio again. Been an awful long time.
It has been. It's good
indeed.
To be back.
Yes, indeed. And DJ, good to have you there on the left coast for us as well. Before we get into, I guess, hard examples of what's happening on the ground in Vancouver, let's start with this as sort of a more question from 30,000 feet, if you like, DJ. What's the intention of drug decriminalization to begin with?
Drug decriminalization is a policy change that recognizes that substance use is a health issue and a public health issue, not a criminal one. It looks at the data over a century that indicates that incarceration does not really decrease substance use. It doesn't act as a deterrent. It doesn't make drugs less available. But what it does do is cause health and social harms, increases cycles of homelessness, over-incarceration of Indigenous people, Black people, and racialized people. And it doesn't really get us to the solutions that we need. So decriminalization is intended to remove some of that stigma and legal sanction to make it easier for people to access services and to be less likely to face short-term incarceration, which can cause harm and risk of overdose and can also lead to other social outcomes like losing your job and losing your housing. Okay.
Derek, any issue with any of that in terms of the goal?
Not really, no.
You're on the same page there.
So far, I think. I mean, I mean, all I would say is that we effectively, even though we don't on the books have decriminalization in Toronto. It hasn't been formally acknowledged by the federal government. I live across the street from a supervised injection site here in the city that has been in the news a fair bit over the last year because a woman was shot out front by some drug dealers that came to the area because of the site. And you know, have spent probably 40 to 50 hours in meetings with Toronto Police Service, high-ranking people, Toronto Public Health. And, you know, one thing that became very clear is that here in Toronto, we have de facto criminalization in the sense that the police, you know, our Attorney General will not prosecute cases for small possession. The police do not, you know, try to do much about open use. They can move people along a little bit. They have some control, but I just thought it was important to point out at the outset that we do, you know, we don't formally have decriminalization, but I would say we have a working form of it here.
But would you agree that part of the idea behind it is to treat it as a public health problem and a health problem, to decriminalize it as that kind of issue and get people healthier at the end of the day? I
agree with DJ in that I see, you know, this crisis as a healthcare crisis, not a crisis that the police are going to get us out of.
Okay. DJ, why did the BC, I mean, this got a lot of attention when it happened not too long ago. The BC government asked for changes in its drug decriminalization plan. Why did they do that?
They were responding to public concerns and increased focus on seeing people in public. So there's been a lot of conversation about whether there has been an increase in public substance use. I'll note that the British Columbia Centre for Disease Control has released a data website just this week, and that there's actually no data to indicate whether there's been an increase or a decrease in public drug consumption.
I got that. Actually, DJ, let me jump in there, because we got those numbers here, and we should share them as long as you've brought it up. Sheldon, I am at the bottom of page 1, top of page 2, so let's bring this graphic up, and for those listening on podcast, I'll read what the BC Coroner Service reports. In the year 2022, there were nearly 2,400 drug deaths occurring. That's 44.5 deaths per 100,000 people. Let's go to the next year, 2023. There were more than 2,500 drug deaths occurring. That's 46.2 deaths per 100,000 people. That's a 6.2% increase. But then so far this year, we're going January to March of this year, 572 drug deaths have occurred, and that's 40.3 deaths per 100,000 people. So that's a big drop. So, okay, pick up the story, DJ, because the numbers go up, the numbers go down. What do you make of it?
In terms of the numbers going up and down, there's a number of factors we have to consider. First of all, decriminalization is meant to help people access health services. That means that those health services have to be there, and we know that we're still lacking in terms of access to even supervised consumption, methadone, other forms of treatment, including abstinence-based treatment and prescribed alternatives. The numbers, however, will not significantly decrease so long as the drug supply itself remains highly variable. Unlike alcohol or tobacco or all of the food that we eat, it's impossible to know what is in everything within the drug supply or to know how strong it is. So when we see that variability in the drug supply, we know that that means that there's an increased danger for people using it because they may not be able to take the same precautions as I would if I was drinking a glass of wine. So if we see the numbers going down now, that is certainly very good news and could be an indication that people are more able to access those health services and are more visible and able to access emergency health care when they need it. However, we do have to take into consideration that the supply will change over time as it has been for many years.
Okay, Derek, do you have a more difficult case to make when you perhaps want to see an end to this program when the numbers are in fact going down so far this year?
You know, I see living across the street from a supervised injection site, we have a small number of them in Toronto, and they were introduced in, the first ones were introduced in 2017, okay? And I think it's important to look at a supervised injection site like a microcosm of decriminalization, because essentially the site has to get an exemption from federal drug laws in order for people to use illicit drugs inside the facility. And so I think from my view, I don't live in Vancouver, but from observing from afar, I mean, I think that there are a lot of parallels between what happened in the unfolding of decriminalization that also parallel what happened here with the unfolding of our supervised injection sites. And what I would say is that, and I have a feeling DJ is going to agree with me to some extent in that, they put this they're both pilot projects. That's one thing they have in common. And, they basically put these things into place, promising certain things that would happen. So for example, a supervised injection site would lower crime. We'd have less open drug use. People will have access to wraparound services. Any
of those things happening?
None of those things happened. Overdoses have tripled in my part of the city. We have before that supervised injection site opened, we had no public use. I mean, it was just shocking to see a needle. Now, once it opened, it basically became a hub of activity. And I guess what of drug activity, drug dealers came where there were no drug dealers before. Suddenly, you have an area that becomes a hub of because it's a safeguarded area.
It's where the customers are.
Yeah, it's where the customers are, exactly. And then, and that leads us to drug dealers. Some drug dealers are armed, and that leads us to a woman being killed last summer tragically outside. But But really, what I see is the parallels between these supervised injection sites and decriminalization. If you watch the Parliamentary Health Committee examining this crisis, you know, they had the deputy chief of the Vancouver Police come on and say that, you know, with respect to, like, they were naive about what the consequences would be of the project as it was unfolded. So, for example, you know, that people were going to be smoking crack in hospitals. People were going to be, you know, there was going to be extended use, you know, in parks where kids are playing, or on the beach, or all the places that Deputy Chief Fiona Wilson outlined. And, you know, she actually said, we warned the BC government of this before, but nobody really ever got back to us. And I would say, in the same way that certain things that were probably foreseeable in retrospect, that were, you know, we should have known were going to happen, the same way we should have known that drug dealers were going to come and occupy around the perimeter of a safe injection site. They, you know, there were noble intentions going into these things. Let's help people. Let's get people help. Let people get supervised as they're using drugs. Now, the other thing I'll end here. Well, hold on. Let me just end here. The other thing that's happened in my neighborhood is we have a supervised injection site, and the truth is, most of the people use outside. They don't want to use in the supervised injection site, and so this whole destigmatization, which I think is a noble thing to pursue, but you know, it's cagey because, you know, we have a safe injection site that's open every day across the street from where I live. Yet we have people using in the alleys and even on the property of, like, I could throw a baseball from the supervised injection site, and there are people because they don't want to. So I'm just saying.
Okay, lots of points made there. I got to give DJ a chance to get in here and respond. Pick it up wherever you like, DJ. A lot of points made there. Where do you want to go?
Well, I think we're certainly in agreement around the desire to see healthier and safer communities for everyone, and a desire to not have instances of tragic violence like my friend here has alluded to. That is tragic and needs to be addressed as the serious issue that it is. When gun violence happens outside of a mall, it gets investigated. Outside of a hospital, it gets investigated. That's really important to do. It's not, however, a reason to stop life-saving services. We wouldn't shut down hospitals. We wouldn't even shut down malls and say that we have to treat them differently because an incident happens outside of one. When we think about sites like this, we have to take into consideration both that they're often not big enough. In Ontario, there's no support for inhalation, even though inhalation is a preferred method of drug use because it comes with decreased risks for things like hepatitis C and HIV infection. It doesn't require the use of a needle. So people will use that as a harm reduction measure, but it also means that they can't use inside the site because it's not allowed. So there's a number of limits to those sites that do need to be taken into consideration. As it relates to seeing people, the other thing that we need to remember is in British Columbia, and I know in Toronto as well, the rates of people who are unhoused are going up constantly and tragically. The one certainty in life is that you have to have somewhere to put your body. Taxes aren't actually a certainty for everyone. The one certainty in life is that you have to put your body somewhere. And for some people, they do not have an indoor space to do that. And the second thing to keep in mind when we're talking about seeing people in public, seeing people for longer periods of time, is that as the drug supply changes, we're seeing the introduction of benzodiazepines and tranquilizers. That means that where someone might have used drugs years ago and sort of gone about their day and you might not even have noticed, the nature of the drug supply now is that people will become very sedated very suddenly, and so you'll see them in that public place for longer. You're more likely to notice it because someone is simply there for longer. So there's all of these factors coming into play. And to your point as well about the, people being outside of a service, we know there are not enough services. So people will wait in line or they don't have somewhere to be after because there's nowhere to wait and there's nowhere for people to go. People have to be somewhere. And so the question then, if we are frustrated, is do we take it out on those individuals who do not have somewhere else to go? Or do we direct that upset at the government and say, let's provide more services. Let's do the things that we said were necessary, like wraparound services, access to inhalation services, more prevention sites, more access to healthcare, and realistically, more pathways out of the unregulated drug market, because so long as people are relying on a supply that is changing every day, people are in danger, whether you use once, on weekends, or every single day.
Derek, I wonder if DJ has really put a finger on what the key issue here is, which is that for the general population, they don't want to see this. If it's happening out of sight, out of mind, in a building, fine. But if it's happening in public, it's too disturbing and we just don't want to see it. You think that's what's going on here?
Well, I think there's a certain amount of people who I think that, for me, living downtown Toronto, I've lived in downtown Toronto my whole life. I don't think people live in a place like Leslieville if they are uncomfortable with a certain level of seeing people with mental illness, seeing people who are in poverty.
You see that everywhere in the city now.
You see that everywhere.
Fairness.
I mean, you don't live downtown if you are uncomfortable or seeing people use drugs. But I think there's a certain element that comes with drug using that the DJ is not really, sort of conceding, which is that it also caused in our neighborhood a massive uptick in theft. We had a 60% rise in assaults within 200 meters of the supervised injection site after it opened. We had a 900% increase in priority 1 911 calls within people who live within 200.
So let me put that
it's
to
not
DJ.
It's not just open use.
I get you, but let me put that point to DJ, because DJ, you did make the point a moment ago that we wouldn't shut down a hospital if there was a shooting outside a hospital. We wouldn't shut down a mall if there was a shooting outside a mall. Why would we shut down a safe injection site? And I guess one possible answer is because there's a direct correlation or connection, potentially, between that site and the crime that took place in a way that wouldn't necessarily be the case with a hospital or a mall. Fair to say?
I don't know that to be the case. So again, you have to look at the specific incident. And again, we're talking about a tragic incident of gun violence. Whether that is specifically associated to a site, I would have to be interrogated, because a site is simply a service. It is simply a service. So what you're asking is for me to extrapolate that because a certain individual was on that location that day, that fact should then be imputed to being correlated to the site specifically.
Yep,
to the point around things like public disorder or crime statistics that my friend has pointed to, I would have to look at that data specifically to understand how it was collected, what the rigor of the data is. We know that there's a significant amount of study. Supervised consumption sites are one of the most studied health services in this country at this point, in terms of more recent interventions. And the data does indicate that these are health-saving, life-saving. If they're properly supported, they do result in decreased public use and decreased litter and things like that. So we know that over the course of time and looking at a number of injection sites, and I'll just name that I live up the street from several of them, only a few blocks away from Canada's first safe injection site at Insight in the downtown east side, we see that they do have these positive benefits. When we look at things like theft or petty crime, again, we have to interrogate whether that is about a safe consumption site or a health service, or is that really about increasing rates of poverty and, in fact, related to policing interactions. Every time someone has their drugs seized, that means they no longer have the small amount of money they had. They're potentially in withdrawal, and now they have to go and seek out those substances again, or maybe try to make money to purchase basic food. Things like that. What we're talking about really is the intersection of poverty, and there's much better ways of dealing with that than opposing services that could potentially put people in touch with things like income assistance, healthcare, and housing.
Okay, we're an Ontario show, so we're going to show some tape here of Premier Doug Ford, because he was asked about this. You both know that Toronto's put an application forward, and the Premier was aware of that, while at the same time being aware of the fact that British Columbia has now responded to public pressure by going back on its decriminalization case. So let's hear from Premier Ford. This is May 15th. Sheldon, if you would, let's roll it.
Drop that application. It's turned into a nightmare. It's turned into a nightmare. I've talked to the Premier out there. It's bad. Reinvest into rehabilitation. The last budget, I believe, was 396. It's 300 and something to reinvest into treatment centers, into health, mental health, and addiction. That's what we should be doing, not legalizing hard drugs. You got to be kidding me. Like letting people do cocaine and crack and heroin. You got to be kidding me. I will fight this tooth and nail. This is the wrong way to go. It's proven. Even in the U.S., they're rolling it back. I think it's Oregon, isn't it? That was rolling it back as well. BC tried it. It's not working. You need to help these people. Give them treatment. Support them. That's what we need. Not say, here's some more drugs to take.
I got the date wrong. That was end of April in Ottawa. Mayor Sutcliffe of Ottawa standing beside the Premier. Your view on his comments?
Well, I mean, I think it's clear that the Premier views treatment as a solution forward. And I guess, you know, I think organizations like DJ's, they, you know, she's talking a lot about the toxic drug supply that's killing people, and I think that's a worthy topic. But there are many out there who feel that the route out of this, or that the answer is to regulate or legalize, you know, the drug supply, and you know, that's the answer. And I think, to be honest, it's kind of a waste of time to talk about it, because I feel like there's no political will, especially right now, to do that. It's not. But
you heard Premier Ford say, Toronto, forget the application for the drug.
No, but I'm saying that's decriminalization. Legalization is another option that's above that. And I guess for me, what I think, you know, there's no point in decriminalizing in drugs formally in Toronto, for the same reason that I don't think there was any point in decriminalizing drugs in BC, despite the noble intentions.
It's already here.
Well, no, because there are no services. I had a meeting with the CEO of the supervised injection site, or the health center, on Monday, and the truth is, we talk about these wraparound services, but they are almost non-existent. They're super ineffectual. It takes weeks to connect anybody with services. There's no psychiatric support. There was a study done by UBC called the Hotel Study, which was a 10-year analysis of the intersection between mental health disorders and substance use disorders. There were about 400 participants in the study. And this was put in front of the Parliamentary Health Committee recently as well. 95% of those people had a substance use disorder of the 400. These are people from downtown Vancouver. 84% had a mental illness, with 74% having a current mental illness at the same time as their substance use disorder. 45% had a neurological disorder that was confirmed by an MRI. So in other words, brain damage. And the testimony was essentially that mental health issues and substance use disorders are the rule. They're not the exception. But we here in Ontario do not have any significant way of that. We're not treating it as a health crisis in terms of the mental health of these people. We're not treating it as a health crisis in terms of access to treatment for these people. And, you know, the truth is, and I agree with Olivia Chow to some extent on this, like, there's no point in talking about decriminalization until we actually come up with a plan. Alberta's come up with a plan. I know DJ doesn't like that plan, but they've at least come up with a plan.
Well, let me go to DJ on this. If you are talking to people in Toronto who are working on the decriminalization efforts, what would your advice be to them at this point?
Certainly. And I would say I agree that there is a need for more services and more care. Decriminalization, regardless, is an important step, even as we continue to work on those other pieces. Often they get posited as, you know, it's either harm reduction or treatment. We would say it's and. We need to have an and conversation. The advice to Toronto would be to continue public education. Decriminalization is largely a conceptual change. It's about trying to remove stigma. And so if we're not doing education to help people understand it, if we're continuing to engage in rhetorical debates that really point anger about a lack of systems care or a lack of policy change towards the people who are most at risk and most impacted, how then can we actually decrease that stigma? It's like saying, don't think of a banana. Never think of a banana. But now I'm going to complain about decriminalization. I'm going to complain about people who use drugs. I'm going to complain about overdose calls, but please don't think of a banana. If we continue to engage in a political rhetoric, it becomes very hard for people to understand the ways in which policy change like decriminalization can be effective, and to really actually talk about what we want for our communities. We want our communities to be healthier and safer for everyone, regardless of their relationship to substances. That means we have to move past this idea of blaming individuals who may not have other options and really look at what works. We've been under the current drug laws for over a century. They have not decreased the availability of substances. They have led to an increasingly volatile and dangerous supply and the incarceration of a lot of people. That costs a lot of money, and it can cause people a lot of harm.
Okay,
Through
let me jump in.
decriminalization, we can shift those resources in the way that Derek would, point to in terms of having other access to care and services.
All right, DJ, thank you for that. Derek, I'm down to my last 30 seconds here. Do you think it's possible to make safe injection sites, such as the one you live near in Toronto, safer, better, healthier, etc.?
No, I don't, because I mean, I'm not against harm reduction. I'm not against supervised injection. I don't think ours should be within 150 meters of 2 schools and 6 daycare facilities and at the heart of our community. And I think ultimately, and even the CEO of the center agrees with this, it's a healthcare facility. They don't have the ability to control the drug dealers that operate around the perimeter or even go inside and deal from inside. And the police, because they are in this realm of decriminalization as well, they don't really have the ability or the desire anymore or the support from the DA or AG to prosecute people. And I don't even think that's a great idea anyway. But the bottom line is, they can't, it's out of their control. This is a situation that a healthcare facility can't control. And I think these are things that we need to really step back and look at before we start signing on the dotted line to formally decriminalize illicit drugs. Let's have a plan. We don't have a plan. Let's get a plan.
Tough subject, and I want to thank both of you for coming on to TVO tonight and helping us out with this. DJ Larkin, Executive Director, Canadian Drug Policy Coalition in Vancouver. Derek Finkel, the journalist and columnist at the National Post, here in our studio. Thanks, you two. In his new essay, The Coming Entropy of Our World Order, futurist Parag Khanna looks at the volatile state of geopolitics and where he thinks the world is headed. He's the founder and CEO of Alpha Geo, and he joins us now from Singapore via Zoom. Parag, it's great to have you on our program again. I guess except for the coming entropy of our world order, how are you doing otherwise?
Other than that, how was the play? Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
it's great to see you again, Steve.
Pleasure to have you back. Let me start with a quote from your article, and here we go. The most accurate description of today's world is high entropy, you write, in which energy is dissipating rapidly and even chaotically through the global system. Okay, let's pick that apart. What is high entropy?
By that, of course, we mean an increasing state of disorder, dissipation of power, a decay, you might say, a diffusion of energy within the system, and that all of which is to say devolution in political terms. In other words, a state of concentration to one of deconcentration, a system in which you have a higher order imposition of rules through hegemony, for example, or unipolarity under the American world order, to one in which you have multiple contesting units of authority, whether it's regional, other superpowers like China, and so forth. So I look at this devolution, not just at the state level, actually, but at many levels in terms of the systems change that's underway, in which you not only have multiple rivals of centers of geographical power, but even transnational actors too. So overall, again, you could call it decay, devolution, degeneration, disorder. They all happen to begin with D. All of those things that people are saying one by one in bits as they grope for terms to describe the world, all of that effectively adds up to this notion of an entropic kind of system.
Is that to say you expect a world with a lot more anarchy?
Well, anarchy is slightly different, right? Anarchy connotes that the units, the participants, obey no authority, there are no principles, perhaps even no governing rules. But in the system I'm describing, there are very clearly self-interested agents, right? And all of them are operating according to their own logic or maybe even similar kinds of motivations, but always attaching, annealing, aligning in different combinations in a way that may seem chaotic, may seem anarchic, but isn't necessarily. Again, it's a world where you've just taken the lid off of the controlling mechanism, and instead you have everyone really acting according to their own volition. And so in that sense, it isn't really anarchy. It's much more a state, again, of of disorder in the sense of a lack of a higher order, but you clearly have principles at work without one single overarching principle.
Give us a few things that you would point to that have made you conclude that this is the apt way to describe what you are seeing in the world today and going forward.
Well, for one thing, it's the shift to multipolarity. Now, the simple way to characterize the shift from a unipolar world to a multipolar world is to simply say you had one superpower, the United States, and now you have at least two superpowers with China. But that would be very neat, simple, rigid, insufficient, and inaccurate to describe the system as a whole. I would say more accurately, it's not only multipolar with multiple systemically relevant great powers or superpowers like the United States, China, the European Union, and so forth, but it's also multi-regional. And even within a big region like Asia, you have multiple great powers within that. So it's a multipolar, multi-civilizational, multi-regional system. That's a much richer characterization that defies a simple symmetrical, hierarchical logic. Instead, again, just within Asia alone, which you might even characterize as a world unto itself, you have China, Japan, India, Australia, and so forth, all operating, again, according to various logics and principles and rules that may be different from the rules that other regions operate by. So it's that complexity, that depth, that layering in which you don't have one global, again, order or approach. That's a very good piece of evidence in this direction. And we really haven't lived in an order like that for many, many centuries.
Let's pluck another quote from your essay here, The Coming Entropy of Our World Order, and this one focuses on American exceptionalism or not, as you suggest. Here we go. That America has lost its exceptionalism in the world's eyes is a far more significant fact than whether America still believes itself to be exceptional or if it ever really was. Okay, let's pull that apart here. Whether America ever really was exceptional in the first place. You're questioning that. How come?
Well, there's two meanings of the word in this context. One is analytical, and the other is sort of, normative or ideational, right? In the ideational sense, any power, any superpower, any empire at the apex of its power is going to hold itself to be exceptional. And that's almost a law of history, right? Throughout history, whether it is ancient Rome or the Ottomans or the Mongols view themselves as to be, supreme, divine, fill in the blank, European colonial powers, obviously, as well. But whether it only works if it's relational, bidirectional. It has to be accepted for it to be valid. Or it has to be analytically true in the sense that everyone is obeying that power. Now, none of those things are true at this point, right? Americans have a great deal of self-doubt as to whether or not they are still exceptional. Secondly, it certainly isn't recognized as true anymore by other powers in the system. And of course, on a relative basis, it's moving in the direction where others are also seeing themselves as increasingly exceptional. So if exceptional is held to be unique, singular, then there can only be one exceptional power in the system, if any, at any given time. And if it isn't recognized that America is that one power, then again, by definition, you wind up in the situation that we're actually in, which is one that is, again, a multipolar world, a competitive landscape, numerous powers that either think of themselves as exceptional or don't care whether or not there is one exceptional power. They simply want to assert their interests. They're certainly not recognizing America as that sole exceptional power anymore.
I guess one of the best examples of that going today is America's effort to get much of the world to follow it in terms of sanctioning Russia for its conduct, its appalling conduct in the war in Ukraine. And yet the attempts to isolate Russia have really fallen flat, with an exception of very few countries. Why do you think that is?
Correct. And again, it was a very severe misdiagnosis of the way in which particularly Asian countries relate to Russia. You can see the map behind me, perhaps. This is Asia, and there's a giant landmass or country at the top of this map, and it is Russia. Now, for a geographer and from a geographical perspective, Russia, the territory, which is indeed the other largest country in the world next to Canada, I should point out, is basically North Asia. But of course, we, as citizens of Western countries or Western analysts, tend to look at Russia through a diplomatic prism. We see it as a country, we categorize it as Eastern Europe. We think of it as culturally European or Eastern European. And we think of it as having once aspired to be part or join Western organizations, in FIFA or the World Bank or the United Nations. It's clustered as a European or Eastern European country. But in reality, of course, it is North Asia, right? That is literally what Russia, by and large, is geographically, North Asia. And so it was a misdiagnosis because, of course, Asian countries, whether it is democracies or non-democracies, whether it's China or India or others, have fairly intense economic ties with Russia. They depend on Russia and benefit from its cheap commodities prices and its proximity. And they did not want to see and do not want to see their import prices and therefore, their trade deficits or current account deficits spike as a result of sanctions on Russia. And so they have not played along at all. And part of that is certainly resulted in, or that has partially resulted in Russia being able to, continue in terms of its economic longevity, despite the pressures that Western sanctions have imposed. So again, you can't isolate Russia. You can't isolate any country in the world if you don't have a single Asian power on board with your sanctions regime. And that's basically what has happened.
Well, let me follow up on that, because if we were to change our orientation of how we think about Russia, not as sort of Moscow and West, but rather as North Asia, how should that change the way we relate to that country?
How we relate to Russia?
Yes.
Well, it's interesting. It is increasingly an anchor of an Asian system, and this Asian system is increasingly economically interdependent. And of course, with Russia, its largest trade partners, investment partners now are literally all Asian, and that's likely to remain the case for a long time. So I would say one has to obviously continue to defend one's Western borders, because just because Russia is increasingly acting like and aligning with Asian powers doesn't mean it isn't still very relevant in the West. It's fighting a war right now with ourselves as Western powers and nations and states and NATO countries. So that doesn't change the fact that it needs to be, if you will, pushed back, repelled, and prevented from remaining belligerent, hostile, and annexing any more territory of Western or Western-leaning countries like Ukraine. So in that sense, the calculation doesn't change. But the diplomatic isolation or that aspect of the strategy is clearly not going to work.
We love to think that the future of humanity is in the West, with Western values projected across the world. But if I read you right, you think the future of humanity lies in Asia. How come?
Well, I mean, there's, again, a literal answer and maybe an intellectual answer. The literal answer to what or who is the future of humanity is Asians, because the majority of the human population is Asians who live in Asia, about 5 billion of them. And the further you look in the future, Steve, as you know, the world population is peaking and actually going to decline relatively soon. So the share of the human population that is Asians in Asia grows, does not recede. So we can be philosophical, and I enjoy that very much. However, the literal answer to the question, who is the future of humanity, is Asians, and Asian youth in particular, because there are more young people in Asia also than in the entire rest of the world combined. Now if we can get into the intellectual part, and you could almost say ideological or ideational sort of question about where the future lies in terms of the vision for the future, or the self, the world view of different regions. Asians do not wake up in the morning, and allow me please to speak on behalf of my 5 billion neighbors here in Asia. I actually dedicated my book on Asia to my 5 billion neighbors, and now that I live here in the region and get to feel that energy of being surrounded by 5 billion people, it's quite awakening and enlightening experience. And I will say, again, on behalf of those neighbors, I don't know a single human being in the entire radius, again, in this vast landmass that you see behind me on this map, these 5 billion people, not one of them, and I think it's just so important, Steve, for me to say it really bluntly, in that American-ish way that I can. Not a single one of the 5 billion people that lives on this map behind me wakes up in the morning saying, I wish my country were more like, Britain or America or something like that, right? Not a single one. So let's just disabuse ourselves of this notion of an intellectual teleology or even a political teleology that leads people in Asia to want to be like us, like Western countries. They want no such thing. Every society that I've traveled in, all 160 of them, really just want to be better versions of themselves. And they're shopping in a marketplace of ideas and policies and history and administrative regimes, and picking and choosing what role models they want to have based on what problem they're trying to solve. They're going to learn about public housing from Singapore. They're going to learn about national service from Finland. They're going to look at environmental conservation policies, maybe from a European country. They're going to get their solar panels and electric cars from China, and so on and so forth. There is no single Western country that serves as an off-the-shelf model for any country in Asia. And again, by literal definition, most people in the world live in Asian countries, democracies and non-democracies. They all just want to be their best selves. They want to achieve the next best thing that they can achieve the next day and the next day and the next day. And I think that's a very good thing, quite frankly. And it forces us to have to compete in that marketplace of ideas and say, if my ideas are better, will they work for you? And how can I help you become what you want to be through my ideas? And if you can't demonstrate that, you're not in the game here in Asia.
Well, okay, I hear what you're saying. Maybe a bit of a strange follow-up here, but I think you're probably the ideal person to ask this question to, given that you were born in India, but educated in, I guess, Britain and the United States. So you're at kind of the crossroads of these two massive cultural institutions, value propositions, and so on. Would you prefer a world that projected more Western values or more Asian values?
Well, I'm for syncretism, and I've written several books about this, as you know, where I kind of look at not an either or dynamic, but a both and, right? What can we learn from each other? What is it about Western conceptions of universal human rights in the sense of individual freedom and Eastern values, if you want to call them that, that you could describe as a communitarian or collectivist, or whatever the case may be. And I think there's virtues in both sides. And I think, again, the winning societies of the future are ones that balance those virtues and don't label them Eastern or Western, but rather think about how do you achieve certain utilitarian outcomes in a society, irrespective of what its cultural background is. Again, to remind everyone, more people live in democracies in Asia than live in democracies in the entire rest of the world. And that's even with a giant non-democratic country called China occupying a big chunk of Asia. That's how many people there are in Asia. That's how many democracies there are in Asia. One can't look at Asia and hold it synonymous with the East, and look at the East and hold it synonymous with China. That's not the way it works. You're talking about 5 billion people who mostly live in some type of a democratic and aspirationally liberal, quite frankly, set of countries. But how that's going to look in the end state is not going to look like Britain or America. Perhaps it could look like a mishmash of models. But then those outcomes, those regime types that we'll see evolve here in Asia, are not going to necessarily adopt Western values or strategies because they're Western. It's going to be things that are universal first and happen to work for them in that context.
Understood. Okay, let's change focus here for a second. And as I indicated in our introduction to start this conversation, you are the founder of something called Alpha Geo. And I guess we need to know, what exactly does that do?
Well, Alpha Geo is a data science company, a geospatial data science company. And what we do is we're on a quest to achieve geographical omniscience, you might even say. We're putting as much data as you can on every geo coordinate of the map as you possibly can attempt to pack into it. And what that means is we're collecting climate data, demographic data, market data, socioeconomic data, everything from air quality and pollution and water, groundwater levels, to future climate scenarios, to geopolitical risk, population density, and packing it all into these latitude and longitude coordinates for the entire surface of the Earth. And then we run simulations and models on that to predict the future performance of geographies so that whether it's public sector needs to understand how to invest better to offset certain climate risks, or the private sector investors are looking at the best places to invest their capital to do a new factory or to build housing, those kinds of things.
Okay, having said that, are you tracking Canada? And if so, what does your tracker show you?
It would be a glaring absence to not cover Canada, wouldn't it? So we cover the entire planet. As I mentioned, literally every terrestrial coordinate we have an awful lot of data on. Canada certainly falls in that category. In fact, we started out with very North American roots and focus. And so Canada, perhaps needless to say, is on a relative basis a far more resilient country from a climate change perspective and from the standpoint of political stability than almost any other place in the entire world. So you might genuinely say it's blessed. But as we like to point out, and as Darwin would have said as well, it's not just this, or survival of the fittest is defined by your capacity for adaptation at the end of the day. So every country is affected by geopolitical risk, by economic risk, by climate volatility. The question is, to what extent do you adapt? To what extent do you build the necessary infrastructures, enact the policies that are going to help you to offset those risks that are sort of coming down the pike in the future or evident today? As you know, I'm very bullish on Canada. I have been for a very long time. Generally for analytical reasons, right? I see it, doing the right things in terms of coping. But I should add, with the climate focus that we do have as a company, this is an area where it is effectively objective, right? It's the hand that nature has dealt you, and in that sense, you've been dealt a very, very good hand compared to a country, say, like India, which tragically is the most populous country in the entire world, and one of those that's most affected by the accelerating onset of climate change.
Well, you've kind of anticipated my next question, because I wanted to ask you about something you said last time you were on this program for something you had written in our national newspaper, the Globe and Mail, in which you said the Canadian dream is reliable, both today and tomorrow, a burden 21st century Canadians should bear with pride. And I wonder whether 3 years after having written that, you still feel as bullish about Canada as you did then.
Well, I always say people vote with their feet. And, if you could distill the complexity of the world and you have to decipher these unfolding trends that are always, cross-cutting and contradictory, whether it is where geopolitics is pushing and where climate is pushing and demographics and labor markets and investment and all of these things, and you were to pick winners and losers in the 21st century, I still believe you could actually boil it down to one simple metric. If a country is absorbing young people, if it is welcoming young people, inviting young people, if young people are voluntarily going to that country, it's doing more right than it is wrong, that's for sure. And one could heap a lot more praise on Canada than just that default statement. Then at the other end of the spectrum, you have those countries that are losing young people. That's not a place you want to be in a world where fertility has dropped, plummeted, in fact, and where the world population is going to very soon, again, peak and decline. You'd much rather be a place that's welcoming young people. And Canada is doing that. So if the young generations, millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, are voting with their feet and choosing Canada by the hundreds of thousands a year, that to me is the single most important metric by which you can measure a country and predict perhaps its future success. So that alone, in addition to, we could leave aside discussions about what is right and wrong about Canadian politics and the Canadian public policy and the direction of the government right now. We could point to flaws and things that are being corrected or otherwise. But even all else equal, if you are attracting young people, chances are you're a place that's going to sort your problems out and have the entrepreneurs, the labor force, the tax base, the homeowners, the teachers, the garbage collectors, whatever the case may be, that you need to function effectively as a society in the future. And if anyone who's in Canada is down on Canada, just look at the places like Russia, like Italy, where populations are declining, where people are leaving, where they're never going to go back, where asset values are declining, depreciating, and so forth.
Okay, well, that's a fascinating answer because, in fact, the government of Canada not too long ago made a decision to cut back dramatically the numbers of young foreign students who can come to Canada, ostensibly, they said, because we've got no place to put them. It's not a matter of xenophobia. It's a matter of we don't have the housing for them. I don't mean to embroil you in domestic Canadian politics, but do you have a view about that?
Oh, no, I'm always happy to wade into other countries' domestic politics. And this is an area about which I have strong opinions because you are, on the one hand, this is the innocent phrasing, is you're a victim of your own success, right? Canada's so popular, so desirable, that you now are overwhelmed and have insufficient housing. But I obviously want to scold the government because having such a praiseworthy liberal immigration policy on the one hand and having had it for years, and not realizing that that means that you need to build more affordable housing, public housing, and so forth is obviously a huge miss, a big wasted opportunity. And now for whatever the next 1 year, 2 years, you're going to have fewer students and less revenue on the back of those students or otherwise in general immigrants who would have come into the country. So, in this sense, having or not having enough of a far-sighted policy to match infrastructure investment and housing policy with the growing population, is an error that you can fortunately rectify. And, to the government's credit and their defense, this is something that's being talked about as we speak, of course, is significantly increasing public expenditure in Canada, raising taxes to fund it as well on housing and other essentials. So I think that you will self-correct, which is, of course, very important for any society to be able to do. So I still really do not only have high hopes for, but quite frankly, a lot of faith in Canada. We're seeing this correction play out.
Parag, thank you so much for that. Be well. Enjoy the rest of your day, or night, as I should say over there.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
Thank
Good
you.
To see you.
Well, in 2016, the United States elected a guy who was sort of a populist on steroids. And you may think that this was the first time that rampant populism had taken hold on the North American continent. It happened 90 years ago right here in the province of Ontario. Let's talk about Mitch Hepburn. Mitch Hepburn was an MPP from southwestern Ontario, and he was, I guess you could call him the boy premier. He became Premier of Ontario in 1934 at the age of 37, and he campaigned on a whole bunch of ideas designed to create a populist furor across the province of Ontario. One of the first things that he decided to do was, he said, all the cabinet ministers who have limousines and drivers, we're getting rid of those. Also, Lieutenant Governor, I know you've got this beautiful home called Chorley Park in Toronto. Guess what? We're selling that. He was going to get rid of speed limits in the province. That one he didn't quite get done, but the other two he did. Mitch Hepburn got into increasing battles with the Prime Minister of the country. And that was kind of strange because Mitch was a Liberal and the Prime Minister, William Lyon Mackenzie King, was also a Liberal. And yet, for whatever reason, the two of them just did not get along at all. Mackenzie King doubted Mitch's judgment. He thought Mitch was trying to be a second Prime Minister in the country. He wasn't totally wrong about that. You know, the job was called Premier of Ontario. But Mitch Hepburn, in order to be thought of on an even plane with the Prime Minister of the country, changed the title of the job in Ontario to Prime Minister of Ontario. Mitch is often remembered for a couple of things. Number one, he's the guy who insisted that milk be pasteurized in the province because he saw that people were getting sick. So we got to give him his due on that. But he also did a lot of other things that made people very upset. In fact, I interviewed his son Peter once. And Peter Hepburn came to TVO and told me a story about how when he was a kid, they often had boarded up the windows of the kitchen because people would drive by the house and shoot the windows out. I kid you not. So, yeah, Mitch was a bit of a controversial guy. When Mitch was living in the riding in southwestern Ontario, okay, that was one thing. But when the House was sitting, he lived at the King Edward Hotel on King Street in downtown Toronto. And there was kind of a lot of debauchery going on.
Oh no, not debauchery.
Debauchery. There was debauchery going on. There was a lot of drinking. There were a lot of ladies of the evening. It was kind of well known, but never reported, that Mitch Hepburn availed himself of all of the sins that a man of that day could avail himself of. Debauchery. After almost a decade of this, Mitch literally walked out of the Premier's office one day at Queen's Park and he walked down the hall to his Attorney General's office. That man's name was Gordon Conant. And he said to Conant, "I've had enough. I'm quitting. You're the Premier now." And he left the building. I know Elvis has left the building, but Mitch has now left the building as well. Well, Conant, being the Attorney General, thought his leadership needed some legitimacy. And so he went before the caucus and he said, "We're going to have an official leadership convention." And then, just as they were getting ready to hold this leadership convention, Conant has a heart attack. And as a result, the job fell to the next most popular guy in that caucus, a guy by the name of Harry Nixon. Harry Nixon, he decided we needed to have an election, so he went to the polls in 1943. Big mistake. All of Mitch's antics, all of the craziness and zaniness surrounding the Hepburn government, those chickens came home to roost. And as a result, Harry Nixon lost the job. He was only Premier for 6 weeks. He's the shortest serving Premier in Ontario history. George Drew, for the Progressive Conservatives, he took over and he became the Premier of Ontario. And all of those antics from the Hepburn years begat 42 straight years of Conservative rule in Ontario. Drew, and then Frost, who won 3 straight majorities in the 50s, and then John Robarts, who won 2 straight majorities in the 60s, and then Bill Davis, who won 4 straight elections in the 1970s and 80s. A 42-year-long Tory dynasty. We used to joke at Queen's Park, there's only 2 parties in the world that you can't beat. Enver Hoxha's Communist Party in Albania and the Conservative Party of Ontario. But it all starts with Mitch Hepburn back in '34, the boy premier, the populist on steroids who comes in and has some legislative victories, but is often remembered today as one of the more unusual people, let's put it that way, to hold that office. Tomorrow on the agenda.
Any way you look at it, the government actually does know that there is a doctor shortage. As you say, we can sort of guess as to why the Minister of Health would say that the shortage is not as severe, or maybe that she would like to believe it doesn't exist. But in the context of these negotiations, I don't think it made the government look very good. It makes it look like they don't know what's going on.